My name is Mahzarin Banaji. I sit in the psychology department at Harvard. I'm going to moderate this session. It consists of 4 people who are psychologists by and large, by training. They're a disorderly bunch that won't sit up here, so they're going to be with you in the audience, and I'll say something about each of them as they come up to speak. So let me say, by way of a few words of setting the tone for what we're going to do, there is a race in this conference to show how poorly trained we are to actually think about institutional corruption, and I think we win that race because we really haven't thought much about institutional corruption per se. But I'm going to argue that we have a place at this table. I'm sorry that the AV system here is so terrible. I'm going to try something else because of the sound here. How is this? Is this better? Okay. All right. Thank you. So I'm going to start with a few things that we heard in the morning session. I'll start first with Bob Putnam's comment that we ought to distinguish between trust and trustworthiness. And it struck me that there are at least 2 examples I can give you for why that distinction might be really quite important. On the one hand, what Larry Lessig has done is to set as part 2, or part B, of the definition of institutional corruption, this idea that an institution is corrupt if and when the public loses trust in it. And there are many, many examples of this, and the point was brought home to me in a very stark way when I met a woman, a black woman who's a professor of medicine and had written put together a very large book on racial disparities in health. And in our conversation, she said to me something like, I would never, ever carry an organ donor card. And I said, why? And she said, because I don't trust that if I'm in an accident and I'm in an emergency ward, and if the doctors know that I am an organ donor, that I will be treated in the same way. This was so stunning to me when I heard this. It just made no sense, and I thought, this is what it means to say that somebody of her kind, who belongs to an upper middle class, socioeconomic class, had lost sufficient faith in the system that she would not carry an organ donor card. So in that sense, I do think Larry is right to say that trust is extremely important. But let me go to Bob Putnam's point that it's not trust, but trustworthiness. And I'll give you an opposite example than this one. Esther Duflo and Rohini Pandey and their colleagues have been doing research in India where they look at villages and they look at who's the head of the panchayat. And one of the things that they've been looking at is what is the structure and what is the degree of corruption in these villages when men and women are heads of these different panchayats. And the data are that when women are heads of panchayats, that you have better access to water, you have better roads, and I could go through a whole series of objective measures that show that the village is doing better. Okay? But people's trust in women as leaders is very low. In fact, they will say, we wish we didn't have a woman as the head of the panchayat because our roads are poor and our water levels are not good and so on. So this disparity tells me that there's something very important about what Bob said about the question of trustworthiness. And here, I mean, the fact that people don't have trust in the system is quite important, but where we would seek to make change would be quite different in these 2 situations of the black woman doctor that I mentioned to you and the Indian village that I just told you about. I also want to take seriously Susan Ackerman's point about definitions. And I want to say that although we absolutely have to be careful about not including everything under the definition of institutional corruption, I do think that we want to be disruptive for a while at the Safra Center with the definition and to begin to include many other things that were previously not included. I see this as a very general trend. Think about what we mean by violence. Okay? There are so many ways in which we've changed in our notion of what we think of as violence or what we think of as discrimination. 30 years ago, when I began to do research on questions of discrimination, the idea that unintended discrimination would even be called discrimination was extremely controversial. And now it has become much more part of ordinary parlance, and I think that the law is going to have to change in some ways as a result of the kind of evidence that is accumulated, arguing that there are many forms of discrimination that previously would never have been considered that way. And if you look at, my colleague Steve Pinker just wrote a book on the decline of violence. So there are many examples in his book, simple things, like, in 16th century France, it was reasonable for a family to take their children out for entertainment in town to watch a cat being burned. Okay? That was considered entertainment. And I'm going to argue that similarly to many of those very important concepts, whether they're of discrimination or violence or corruption, one of the major shifts that we are seeing is that our standards are changing, and they're changing because people in this room, largely philosophers, political theorists, ethicists, legal scholars, have been pushing what that definition might mean. So I'm going to argue that we open up the definition, that we include more things than have perhaps previously been thought of as institutional corruption, and then we'll move back and draw a new boundary. And I'm perfectly comfortable with us doing that. There is a point that I want to make before I introduce the panel to you, and that is that if Larry has raised the stakes for us by saying that things that are currently legal need to be considered anew, and the question asked of whether they are actually corrupt practices and procedures, is quite important, because one of the things that I have been struggling with is something that is even more confusing, and that has to do with really pro-social behaviors that we perform. In my field, there has been a huge movement towards trying to look at the good side of people's nature. The assumption is that people like me have been paying attention to the rotten side of people's nature for too long, and that what we need to do is to look at altruism, to look at cooperation, to look at helping, which are also deeply evolutionarily tied to our nature. We are both kinds of people. And I want to raise the following for you. I'm writing in a book a chapter called Carla's Hand. Carla was an assistant professor at Yale University when I was one, and in the late 80s, we both looked extremely young, even for our age. And the story is very, very simple. Carla cut her hand in a very deep way and was rushed to Yale New Haven Hospital, where the attending doctor was very attentive and said to her that he would sew her hand up just fine and that she would be fine. Her partner kept saying that Carla was a quilter, and that as a quilter he wanted to make sure that Carla got all the necessary attention so that she could continue her quilting work. And the doctor reassured them that that was indeed going to happen. While Carla's hand was being sewed up, a student at Yale who was in Carla's class and was volunteering at the hospital saw her and said, "Professor Kaplan, what are you doing here?" At which point the doctor just stopped in his tracks and said, "You're a professor here?" Because Carla did not look like a professor. And when she said yes, he sent her off to the 4th floor, called 2 other doctors in, who operated on her hand for 9 hours. So the treatment that Carla got was actually touted as a very good thing when it happened. Carla was glad that this happened to her, that her hand got the treatment it did. The doctor was very proud that for a person who was from the Yale system, he had done something good. And so I want you to take this example and ask the question, can we even ratchet up the notion of what's corrupt further by asking the question of whether a fundamental act of helping that we do for lots of people who are close to us is something that we need to begin to think of as corrupting in a variety of ways, because we do have control. When somebody calls me up, friends of mine, and they want me to walk their child into the office of a dean here, who in 2 years will be applying for admission, what should I do about that? I used to walk them around and show them around, and I think I will still show them buildings at Harvard, but I am much less likely now to introduce them to a dean at Harvard. And so these are changes in my own behavior that have come from shifting what I mean even by the concept of helping. And I just put that before you because this is something that I think we're going to have to think deeply about. Anyway, let me introduce our panel to you, and I'm just going to do them one at a time. They'll come up here and speak. There are 4 of them. They're all, in one way or another, psychologists. They call themselves decision scientists, organizational behavior psychologists, social psychologists. But we are combined in this notion of wanting to look at what's normative and then what behaviors actually get exhibited, and the disparity between what we hold to be very important values to ourselves and then how our behaviors unfold. And the reason we think this is important is because it is no longer a distinction between what I believe to be right and good versus what you believe, but what two parts of my own mind might believe to be right and good. And the reason this is important is because we now know from very good empirical evidence, and you can talk to people who are molecular biologists and neuroscientists and so on, most of them will tell you that 90 to 95% of the brain's work happens without us having conscious awareness of it. If indeed that is the case, if large numbers of decisions are getting made well below the surface, well under the threshold of conscious awareness, I think we do owe ourselves the question, how do we want to regard the consequences of those actions? And to what extent do we want to put the focus on intention versus on impact? Our first speaker is, let me just get my computer so I can tell you a few things about Eldar. Eldar Shafir is William Stewart Todd Professor of Psychology and Public Affairs at Princeton University. He's actually not unfamiliar with this town. He got his degree a couple of T-stops away from here. And he has focused on the question of economic decisions by looking at how human beings reason, how they make decisions, how they make judgments, especially under conditions of conflict, under conditions of uncertainty. And a theme of his work is exactly what I said, this tension between normative assumptions on the one hand and what the behavioral findings from the research are telling us. In recent years, Eldar has focused his attention on the question of poverty and challenging some very fundamental theories in the social sciences about what the causes of poverty are. And he's also been played a major role in as a professional. He was president last year of the Society for Judgment and Decision Making, and he has a book that's coming out, an edited volume called The Behavioral Foundations of Policy. So with that, let me welcome Eldar Shafir, and Eldar is going to tell you about a range of data from the area of behavioral economics on how humans make decisions.
Thank you, Mahzarin. It's great to be here. I have a terrible cold. I cannot hear myself talk or think, so bear with me. I also don't know that much about corruption, except I know I see it. But what I'm going to try to do is give you a bit of a sense of how a behavioral scientist thinks about the tension between what we think drives, motivates, guides human behavior and what in fact does. And I don't think it elevates to the level of a theory, but my thought is that there's an enormous aspect, as Mahzarin was saying, an enormous amount of mental life that's occurring of which we have no awareness and which we cannot control, and that not understanding that level of mental life leaves us basically with failed policies, with failed regulations, with failed legislation. And it seems to me, and this is something that we will discuss further, leaves open a gaping hole where corruption can thrive. So if we think about legislators and regulators as in the business of avoiding it, I'm going to argue that they need to understand human behavior. To the extent that they don't, they're going to fail to do the things they intend to do, and what we will see instead is a lot of failure, among other things, a lot of potential corruption. There's a lot of very beautiful, clean work in behavioral science that's not terribly counterintuitive. The notion of motivated beliefs. That, as I join an organization, I start believing more and more in what people tell me is good for the organization. In reciprocity, which has an enormous impact, I think, on potential corruption. I want to take a slightly more exotic stance, just to give you a flavor of the research. I'm really going to focus on things that are not terribly intuitive. So reciprocity is not surprising. A motivated belief is not terribly surprising. I want to try to give you another type of thing. If you want a metaphorical example, we know now that when a waiter or a waitress touches you on the shoulder, you tip higher. That's the kind of thing I'm interested in. Because, when a waiter or a waitress touches you on the shoulder, this is gender independent, you tip higher. Now, if we believe that you ought to tip as a function of the quality of the service, you can see lurking here a potential for corruption of some sorts, especially if we're not aware of it. If the waiter might be, or the restaurant owner might be, and nobody knows about it, we can regulate it. You can see that's kind of a cute metaphor, but I'll try to give you some more serious examples. I'm borrowing heavily from a distinguished economist almost a century ago, who said, the economist, he was talking about economics, where you can fill in lawyer, regulator, teacher, parent, taxi driver, anybody you want, may attempt to ignore psychology, but it is sheer impossibility for him to ignore human nature. If the economist, lawyer, or legislator borrows his conception of a man or woman from the psychologist, his constructive work may have some chance of remaining purely economic in character. If he does not, he will not thereby avoid psychology. Rather, he will force himself or herself to make their own, and it will be bad psychology. The argument is if you do any sort of social science, you cannot avoid assumptions about behavior, and either you make them well or you make them badly, and when you make them badly, bad things will happen. So that's kind of the idea. What's bad psychology? I'll give you a couple of quick examples just to kind of train your thinking. I'll give you a theoretical one and an applied one. Take Pareto Optimality. So we all know and love Pareto Optimality. If there's a state of the world that's better for somebody than our current state and no worse for anybody else, that's a better state of the world. That notion is logically unassailable, except it may not be true in dollars. So it turns out, based on behavioral research, that if I gave 10 people in this room a 100% raise in salary and everybody else a 2% raise, well-being in this room may have gone down rather than up, because people's judgment of well-being is heavily a function of comparative wealth and earning, not just absolute worth. There's nothing, I'm not criticizing Pareto, he has a very brilliant idea here, but notice it may not be true in dollars, and that's a fact about human perception and behavior, but it's an important one, because if we think that dollars do it, and it turns out they don't, we then have institutions like, the Treasury or the Fed, whose business is to improve economic well-being, who are working on GDP, whereas they should be more concerned with inequality. Okay, I have no solutions. I'm going to throw thoughts out there, and we can think about them more, but that's the idea. If we fail to understand the psychology that drives well-being, we will do things that look logically compelling and may actually fail. A more applied example, so until a few years ago, about 15 states in the Union had what's known as a two-tier welfare law. The two-tier welfare law said that if you're a welfare recipient who moves from state A to state B, if state B pays higher levels of welfare, you, for the first 12 months of residence in the new state, are entitled only to your former state levels of pay. So if you move to higher paying state, you get a lower level for a year. This is no longer legal. It was struck down by the Supreme Court because it violated the freedom to travel, totally separate story. But what's the point here? Those who are doing this law, let's assume they're perfectly innocent and well-intentioned, have come to believe, and we have trained them to believe it, that welfare recipients try to maximize welfare payments. So the vision is as a single mother of two, surfs the web, sees where they get the high payment, hops in our SUV and goes there, and if we don't stop them, they'll all go there, and we have to be careful. Turns out people don't move for welfare payments. There's a lot of evidence. Mobility from lower to higher paying states equals, in fact, for some reasons, is lower than mobility from higher to lower paying states. Mothers move because they found a job, because they found a babysitter, because they found an apartment. But now notice what happens. We have a law based on the assumption she's moving to maximize welfare. She's in fact moving because she has a babysitter. But in $1993, when she moved from Mississippi to California, instead of $565, which merely guaranteed her subsistence, we gave her $120 a month for a year, which guaranteed her demise. And so this is, from my perspective, one way to think about it is a corrupt system, corrupted not by evil intention, corrupted by a set of assumptions that are just not true about the citizens whose behavior you're trying to influence, and leads to very, very bad outcomes. So that's the story. Now, one area that's very popular still, and you can see it in many applications, is assumptions about proliferation of alternatives. So the idea that's very salient in today's policy world and government is that well-functioning markets are a wonderful thing. We'll give people as many options as possible. They're rational choosers. They'll choose the best ones. This will force competition, and everybody benefits. There is a lot of research that suggests that's not the case. It suggests that people have a very hard time choosing. If you give them too many alternatives, They either freeze, they fail to choose, or they choose badly. And this is an important story. So when President Bush came out with Medicare Part D, one of the most expensive domestic programs he had ever proposed, and it was estimated at $720 billion, it was higher after that, they were proud of the fact that they're going to bless elderly citizens, potential recipients of Part D, with many alternatives. If you can't see, that's sort of a metaphorical idea. So if you're a recipient of Medicare Part D, a potential recipient in Florida, you had 43 alternatives that differed in about 40 dimensions. This would go around halfway down that wall. And there were things that mattered. So for example, monthly premiums ranged from $10 to $100. Deductibles ranged from 0 to 50. There were some things that mattered. Some drugs you can buy in some plans and not others. Some allowed you to buy drugs out of state and some didn't. And you had to choose. Now, when this was proposed, people who know about this said, this is not reasonable. You can't give an elderly recipient in Florida 43 alternatives and expect them to do something good. But here's an interesting tension, because the theory driving this said, choosers are rational choosers. Even if it's not easy, they'll recruit their accountant, their educated daughter in Chicago. They'll do what's needed to do the right things. There's a lot of research on this. There were massive take-up problems. People failed to take up. A lot of things were done to help the take-up. We recently did a study where we went a step further and said, okay, you finally took up. How well did you take up? How well did you choose? And people chose badly. So these are actual recipients who have the entire Medicare record for the last year, all the drugs you took. Based on the last year, assuming that next year is going to be like last year, how well did you choose out of the options available? And basically, people are choosing between about a quarter to a half of the options that are better than the one they took for them. Okay? And then we show that if with certain very simple behavioral interventions, you can help them do better. Now, there's a lot of libertarian paternalism, things that you may have encountered from Sunstein and Thaler and others that have to do, in some sense, with these sorts of issues. So one proposal would be, for example, if I'm a libertarian paternalist, if I'm behaviorally informed, but I don't want to limit your choices, instead of landing on you those 43 options you saw, I give you 6 that a distinguished panel of medical experts decided capture most of what you need. And I said to you, here are 6 that a panel thought are terrific. Feel free, if you're into that sort of thing, to go to the second page where there's another 37, but you don't have to. And if you do that sort of thing and give people 6 to choose from, one of which allows you to buy out of state and one doesn't, one which gives you a high premium and one does not, you can show that choice is much more successful. And again, the argument from my perspective is, to the extent that we're driven by an assumption that's just wrong about our population, are we not corrupting the institutional responsibility and what it is that it's exploring or trying to do? Advertising is a fantastic story. I'm not going to spend much time on it. This is back to this idea. There's an enormous amount of mental life happening of which we're not aware. Is anything happening to you right now? It's very annoying blinking. Now, that blinking lasted 350 milliseconds, which is shorter than the time you get darkness every time you blink. Now, so when you sit here and you look at me, you blink for longer than this. In fact, you get 1 hour of nothing but darkness as input every day of your waking lives, of which you're entirely unaware. You have a magnificent machine behind the eyes and between the ears. It's doing all the work necessary for you never to know this happened. It's doing fantastic work, but it's also doing some funny things, like this. When you show people these pictures, it ought to be seen as fairly cheap talk. Who cares you show me these pictures? I don't seriously believe that if I smoke, I'll start dating these beautiful people and have an Italian villa. Nonetheless, it turns out, when you do this sort of thing, it has a strong impact on people's tendency to smoke. Now, we forbid subliminal advertising because we say people have no control over that. Well, it's not clear people have any control over this either. And there's a lot of data that you go down, you drive down Mass Ave, and there's a poster, you don't know you saw it, you just really feel like having a Coke. And that has very similar implications, and it's at least open to discuss what does that mean for the regulator or the legislator whose citizens are driven by motivations very different from what's typically assumed. I can't resist just because I love this so much. So this is an advertising for Burger King. You've all had Burger King before. It doesn't look like this, and you know it. This guy collects these. This is the most attractive angle, slightly fluffed up. Here's another, so equal opportunity for all. Here's my favorite. So what he does now is he's going to show you the commercial and prove to you that the advertising burger doesn't fit in the box that they used to sell it for you. All right, so this is happening left and right. There's no control, no regulation over this. It's influencing people's preferences in serious ways. How serious does it get? This is a study that we did in South Africa. You'll see immediately why you couldn't do this in the States if you wanted to. These are money lenders who are lending money in a predatory lending market, very high interest rates. What we did here is people, all of whom have used this money lender before, at least once, an average of 5 times, get an invitation to apply for a loan. This is what it looks like, and we randomize the interest rate that's offered to you between 3 and 12% monthly at increases of 0.25%. So you might get 4.75, you might get 6%, etc. In addition to randomizing the interest rate, we randomize certain behavioral features. So for example, the number of examples that you're shown of the loans you can have, and say the picture down here. So you see this person has 4 examples of different loans they can have. This picture gets only 1 example. Now, they're all entitled to many, and they've used this lender before, but you get fewer examples, much less load in the table. These guys have this dude here in the bottom right. Others get a dudette, and others have no picture at all. Now, why are we doing this? These are 60,000 people. It's all for real. The data is based on actual loans taken, which are worth about 2 to 3 months of income. It's all for real. All the data I'm giving you is actual loans given. Another question is, what happens here? So, economics is right. As you increase interest rate, take-up goes down. Nice. But here's an interesting fact. Among others, I'm going to skip a few. When you change, what we can do when we do this cross-study, I'm going to get into details, we can ask, what does changing the picture from a man to a woman does to take-up relative to interest rate? Is it the same as increasing interest 1%, lowering it by 2? What does it do? That's what this structure allows us to do. For example, when you change the picture on the letter, remember the burgers, remember the women, beautiful women and men with cigarettes? You change a picture on this letter from a man to a woman. Take-up of this loan, 3 months worth of income for real, goes up the equivalent of lowering interest 4.5 percentage points monthly. It's a lot of money you're paying for a picture in the bottom of a letter you're about to put in the garbage. It's not like you're going to hang it over your desk. Okay, so that's to say now, what do we do with that? If we don't take it seriously, if we think it's just an error and it's irrelevant, if we think our recipients of these letters are rational enough to resist this stuff, we are driving policies that in some sense might fail, might be corrupted vis-a-vis what it is that we're trying to do in helping people to take better loans and live a better life. There's a lot of others, I'll give you a couple of. Accuracy and confidence is an enormous one. We are massively overconfident creatures and we don't get it. We don't know it, and it could lead to some really painful outcomes. So for example, in the legal setting, obviously this is a very idealized fact. You can do many different studies, but in general, the correlation between the confidence of an eyewitness and her accuracy is about 0.4. You think lower. So you'll think lower, I'm being generous. What's the correlation in 0.4? That's roughly the likelihood of meeting a tall woman or a shorter man. So when you see an extremely confident eyewitness about to send somebody to the death chamber, that correlates. The chance they're correct is about the same as seeing a tall woman or a short man. It's very weak, and if you look at false convictions, in most cases in our complicated history on this, there's an eyewitness involved who's overconfident, and neither she nor the jury understand that confidence has very little signal value. We just don't get it, and again, to the extent we don't allow for that to enter the picture, we're creating institutions that are failing in some very deep sense. If you haven't heard about Cassano, Michael Lewis has a magnificent piece in Vanity Fair, highly recommended. Cassano was an AIG. Here he says, it is hard for us without being flippant to even see a scenario within any kind of realm of reason that would see us losing $1 in any of these transactions. He says this 5 minutes before they lose $190 billion. And why, there's freaks out there, but the point is that expertise and the confidence of experts has an enormous impact on the population, on all of us. And we need to think about how to deal with that, because otherwise it's massively corrupting. When he says things like these people invest their funds, and when experts in this room, me included, look confident about what we're talking about, you tend to believe it. And somehow we need to think about how to adjust for that, because there's an enormous potential corrupting factor if we don't prepare well. And we don't prepare well. So I'm doing a lot of stuff on the floor. I'll give you one example that to me is striking. There's a low take-up of benefits programs in the US. So the US offers not enough, but a fair number of benefits programs, and take-up is low. Food stamps is kind of the only thing left for the poor in America these days. Take-up is still low, and the question is, why don't the poor get it? Second Harvest has a collection of all food stamp applications from all 50 states. This is not random, it's one of my favorites, I'll admit. So this food stamp application is 36 pages long. And let me read to you one paragraph out of the 36 pages, just one paragraph. If you're a non-citizen applying for Medi-Cal and you're not a LPR, an alien who's a lawful permanent resident of the US, B, an amnesty alien with a valid and current I-688, or C, PRUCOL, an alien permanently residing in the US under color of law, please, there's a lot of PhDs in this room. Do you know what just happened? No, your welfare, a food stamp applicant gets 36 pages of these. At some point they mention to you that you're doing this on the penalty of perjury and might find yourself 20 years in jail if you misreport. Finally, quote, tell me when is the last time somebody said this to you. Please be prepared to spend several hours from 7 till noon. You will not be seen if you're 6 minutes late. So basically they treat you like a PhD, a criminal, and a baby all within one application. And guess what? Take-up is low. Now there's sort of two interpretations of this. One is that those who devised this book are behaviorally remarkably sophisticated and knew just what to do not to pay benefits. But even I'm not that cynical. I think at the end of the day, those who designed the book probably wanted it to work. But we train our students at the Wilson School, the Kennedy School, to believe that people are driven by costs and benefits. And if you're a welfare recipient who has understood how much you tend to gain from this painful 5-hour process, you realize it's worth it. I mean, how much is your hour worth when you're a food stamp recipient? $10, $20, $100, it's still worth 5 hours. So if we train people to think cost benefits, we create institutions that create monsters like this, which ought to work, but they don't because people don't function this way. Of course, the food stamp recipient here, the potential recipient, doesn't say, I hereby declare I will never apply. She just says, oh, 5 hours and lots of insults? Not today. I don't have a babysitter, I don't have the time, I'll come another time, and life passes by. So you can get a little bit more strategic on this. We did some stuff with Michael Barr when he was in Treasury on behaviorally informed financial regulation. And the idea basically is when you think about the agent as we're thinking about them, I lost something. You need to think about what implications that has for the interaction between the regulator and the citizen or the bank. And what's interesting here is it's going to be, if you get the idea, you understand it well, you can make some sense of it. So let me give you one example. People are very bad at compounding. They fail to understand what compounding means, what implication it has. If you underestimate compounding, you're going to be somebody who undersaves and overborrows. You're going to misunderstanding the implications of saving and borrowing, so you're going to undersave and overborrow. The regulator wants to help you. How does the bank feel? The bank is very happy to help you save. And if you go out there today, there are many very sophisticated instruments that are behaviorally informed and try to help people save more. Save more tomorrow, save more after tomorrow, all kinds of stuff. What about borrowing? The regulator wants you to borrow less. Banks are much less impressed by that idea. And you will not find a single instrument out there trying to help you borrow less. And so the argument is if you have a behaviorally informed regulator, you know where it is that you have to regulate, namely you have a strategic tension with the bank, and where it is that your interests are highly aligned vis-a-vis this strange citizen you're trying to control, and how to go about it. Anyway, so I'll finish here. How we build our markets, our laws, our regulations are going to be heavily dependent on the assumptions that we make about human behavior and what we understand. To the extent that those assumptions are wrong, those institutions are going to fail in profound ways that leave, I think, gaping holes for corruption. All right, I'll stop there.
Thank you to Eldar. Hold your questions for Eldar until later in the afternoon when we will get the panel together. But let me introduce, in the meantime, our next speaker. Anne Tenbrunsel is a professor in the business school at Notre Dame. She's Rex and Alice Martin Professor of Business Ethics, and she also co-directs an institute that is devoted to increasing ethical behavior in businesses worldwide. She has a degree in industrial and operations engineering, an MBA, and a PhD in organizational behavior. Anne has done a lot of work on decision-making in the negotiation context. She studies a phenomenon called ethical fading, which I think she will speak about today. She's interested in how people make errors in forecasting. She's interested in the infrastructure of institutions that lead to unethical behavior, and how people might, in unintended ways, defect in social dilemmas. She most recently wrote a book called Blind Spots: Why We Fail to Do What's Right and What to Do About It, with Max Bazerman. And she's going to tell us today about ethical fading.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thanks, Mahzarin and Larry, for letting me be here. If you know my presenting style, I'm a walker, and that's not going to be possible, so apologize for any extra hand movements that I might exhibit here. Back about 18 years ago, when I was looking for my first academic position, I was at a great business school in a great university, presented my dissertation, which was on ethics, and I was asked the question, well, stuff is really all interesting, Anne, but what are you going to study when this is no longer a fad? Thanks, as you know, to companies in the past decade, I'm still in business, as are many people in this room. But my answer then and my answer now is that it's not a fad, that we continue to see this cycle of unethical behavior repeating itself. And those of you who have been around long enough, or those of you who have been studying this long enough, know that these companies were simply preceded by other companies that grabbed headlines in their own time. So the question is despite, which is really what this conference is despite regulatory efforts, despite organizational efforts, despite a lot of efforts in the academic world, why do we continue to see this? And what I want to argue, along with some of the same points people have made, is in part it's because our efforts and our interventions have been based on a couple of faulty assumptions, at least two of them. One is we've heard about, and that is that we assume the bad apple. So we study bad apples, and why do bad apples kind of exist in the world. What I think many of us are arguing here is we need to kind of shift where our focus is from intentional unethical behavior to unintentional unethical behavior. The other assumption that you saw up there was moral ignorance, and that is, well, people don't know what to do when presented with an ethical dilemma or an evidence of corruption. That is, they just don't really have the tools. So we need to give them that. Lots of fun studies I could show you. This is maybe the most compelling. This was a study done of libraries in the US and in the UK, and what they looked at were stolen books. What they found was that ethics books were more likely to be stolen than non-ethics books. Now, we don't know what that means, right? Maybe it's the unethical people, they know they're unethical, they're kind of embarrassed to check these books out, so they steal them instead. But then what they looked at were obscure philosophy books, used only by professors and graduate students. And what they found was that ethics books in these obscure philosophy sections were 50 to 150% more likely to be stolen than the obscure philosophy non-ethics books, presumably by the graduate students and professors of ethics. And so to the author's title, do ethicists steal more books? He concluded, yes, they do. So simply giving knowledge and having vast degrees of knowledge of ethical frameworks doesn't necessarily seem to be the answer. And yet, that's what a lot of our fixes kind of focus on. So let's give people ethics training, let's give them codes of conduct, let's let them know how they should resolve these dilemmas. Or in the case of intentionality, if you behave this way, this is going to be the consequence. And yet both of those, I think, ignore what we're saying, at least many of us on this panel, the psychology of the individual. And in doing so, despite great desires and despite a lot of money and a lot of attention, we're going to continue to see this cycle. What we have argued is that to understand that psychology and really to understand why it is that people behave not in contradiction to some normative standard, but actually in contradiction to their own standard. We're really starting there. That is, they behave in ways that are against their own values. And key to this, don't realize that they're doing so. That to understand that, we really need to understand what happens at 3 phases of the decision-making process. We need to understand what happens when we're thinking about the decision before us. We need to understand what happens when we actually make the decision. And then we need to understand what happens when we're reflecting back on that decision. And more specifically to some of this notion of kind of 2 brains within us, what we argue is that in the prediction phase, our thoughts are really dominated by what we think we should do. And in fact, it's argued that we think much more abstractly at that point in time. The time of the decision, that battle between what we think we should do and what we want to do is won out by our want selves, so we behave in ways that contradict our values. But when we reflect back on that decision, again, we're thinking of that more in terms of how our behavior was maybe more in line with how we thought we should have behaved than it actually was. The discrepancy between prediction and action is driven by a psychological phenomenon known as behavioral forecasting errors. Great example of this comes from a study done by Woodzyka and LaFrance, who asked female college students to think about a situation in which they were interviewing for an internship on campus. There was a male who was 32 who was interviewing them, and during the course of that interview, he asks the female applicant 3 questions. Do you have a boyfriend? Do men find you desirable? And do you think it's important for women to wear bras to work? People thinking about this situation, predicting how they would behave, 68% say I would refuse to answer them. Certain proportions say I'd rudely kind of leave and storm out. When they actually, how they got through human subjects, I don't know, but they actually put female college students in this situation, had a male who was 32 who asked those same 3 questions. No one refused to answer the questions. And there's a whole host of phenomena that said we predict we're going to behave one way and we don't. And then again, through revisionary ethics, we look back on that behavior through some of the biases that are articulated. We look back through that behavior and see the good in it and walk around, in some sense, believing we're more ethical than we really are, because our unethicality is kind of hidden between predictions that we will behave ethically and a recollection that we did. And so the problem we argue here is that we know that to make effective decisions, we need to accurately plan and reflect. That's kind of basic decision-making 101, but the planning and the reflection don't reflect that decision. So what I want to do, I could talk about that framework in much more detail, but what I really want to do with our time here is talk what I think, one of the problems I think happens, and that is at the action phase. And what I believe happens a lot, or at least partially explains what happens in the action phase, is that at the time we're making the decision, we fall kind of prey to something that we call ethical fading. And that is that we don't necessarily see that this is an ethical decision. And as a result, we don't need to call up those principles and guidelines and training, because guess what? It's just not that type of decision. So what Dave Messick and I called ethical fading, where again we say people don't see the moral components, not because they're morally uneducated, but because psychological processes fade these ethics. What we argued is that there's these situational cues that evoke a process of self-deception, that in turn influences the type of decision, and that in turn influences my propensity to engage in unethical behavior. Decision frames play a key role here, so I want to just show you a little bit of what informed our thinking on this. One was some theoretical work done by March and Messick, who argued that the very first thing we do when we encounter a situation is we ask ourselves, what kind of situation is this? And once we have answered that question, all of the variables that social psychologists or people like myself study, behaviors, attitudes, norms, expectations, could very clearly be predicted. So powerful, Dave Messick has argued, that we could go back and understand all of social psychology, including the more famous experiments, more parsimoniously, if we could first understand what type of decision were the participants, did they believe that they were in. So also some kind of early research on frames, though the authors didn't characterize this as that. Some work by Rick Larrick and Sally Blount. They looked at 2 games that are used to study cooperation, ultimatum games and social dilemmas. And they found that despite sometimes identical payoffs, they found very different patterns of cooperation. What they argued and found support for was that ultimatum games use different words. They use things like accepting, rejecting, And dilemma games use words like claiming. And they found that by simply switching the words, they could actually switch the pattern of cooperation. Madan and his colleague also found that a social dilemma described in financial goods, monetary goods, versus social goods had very different cooperation rates despite the fact that the payoff was the same. And so what that indicated to us is that these were evoking different frames, despite the fact that the payoffs were identical, which in turn influenced their behavior. What I want to do is show you a quick example, if I move this forward. There we go. Of the relationship between frames and unethical behavior, and then I'm going to back us out and show us one situational cue that just as an example of how this kind of influences our behavior without us knowing it. This came from it was a very small portion of a study Tina Diekman and I just completed. And what we did is we had people do 3 tasks, and they were put into one of 2 frames. So the first 2 tasks, think about a decision and a word completion task, were designed to get them into either a business frame or an ethical frame. The dictator game was designed to measure their unethical behavior. So those people in a business frame, the first task they saw was this. Please think about a business decision, think about the aspects that should be involved in that decision. And these are 2 examples. Well, from my experience, I first decide what I may gain from the decision, how it will affect my future, the overall percentile that's likely to succeed or happen. Another person wrote, I would think mainly about the financial aspects of that decision. That way I'd make sure the benefits outweigh the risk when it comes to making a profit. They then did a word completion task. 3 of the words were generic, but 3 had business connotations. The ones there with yellow, so market, profit, and business. Those in an ethical decision were asked to think about an ethical decision. You see their answers here. When making an ethical decision, you should think about whether or not it's fair to everyone, whether people will be hurt, does it harm anybody, is it in the interest of the greater good. And again, they had a word completion task. And 3 of the 6 words, the 3 generics were the same, but the ethical words were different than the business words, moral, ethical, and virtue. And so independent of which frame, so now you're in a frame, and independent of which frame you're in, you're now subject to a variation of what's called an ultimatum game. So those of you not familiar with ultimatum games, ultimatum game is a situation, let's say it's Mahzarin and I have $100. I say to Mahzarin, I'm going to give you 40 of that, in which case I get the remainder, which is 60. She can accept that, in which case she gets 40, I get 60. Or she can reject it, in which case we both get 0. This was a variation in 2 ways. One, it was what's known as a dictator game. Mahzarin had no choice. She had to accept what I gave her. And she also didn't know the size of the pot from which I was allocating. So I knew I had 87. Mahzarin was told it's somewhere between 5 and 90. And so what I had to do in making my offer to Mahzarin is tell her what I'm giving her, and then also tell her the size of the pot. And that's what we were interested in, is did I tell the truth? And the frame that I was in substantially influenced that honesty, such that those in an ethical frame, the average pot size reported was 8411. And remember, honest is 87. And those in a business decision, the average pot size was substantially less. What I think happens in this situation is that there are, if we back us out now, is there are these situational cues that influence the extent to which we see the ethics in the decision, which in turn influence my behavior in ways that I don't intend and am actually not aware of. So I want to talk a little bit about a compliance system, which has all kinds of words. So if I'm not using the words you're used to, I apologize. But in general, when we think about a lot of the fixes to ethics, it's been to kind of monitor and set a standard, monitor people. If they're doing well, let's reward them, and if they're not, let's provide a sanction. Lots of problems with standards. I'm not going to talk about it, I just want to alert you to research that has been done on this. We know that our mind becomes so focused on meeting the standard that we don't think about the objective behind the standards, and often recommend policies that are focused on the standard and not the objective behind the standard. We don't go beyond the standard of psychological process known as moral compensation. It means that if I think that I did something good, we find that people then feel okay doing something bad, and vice versa, which means we kind of never improve our standard. And I'd argue too, and there's some research on this, that our standard even unknowingly shifts downwards. Not only doesn't it go up, but it shifts down. Reward systems also dangerous, but what I really want to talk about is that last part, kind of the punishing part, the monitoring and punishing if we don't meet the standard. Certainly, these kinds of systems, as I mentioned, super popular, such that the failure to seriously monitor, measure, and reward or punish is going to leave codes of conduct operating in a vacuum of no use for us. We see that in Sarbanes-Oxley. It requires internal corruption tools. There's been a whole industry that's sprung up with monitoring systems. Compliance officers now required at all publicly held corporations, making them, it's argued, at least as important to corporate success or survival as CEOs and CFOs. So very much a focus on compliance. And yet what Dave and I were worried about was, we know there's downsides to this. So we knew it decreased trust, intrinsic motivation, self-esteem, creativity. What we also were worried about is that it could increase ethical fading. So what we did is we ran a series of studies designed around a couple of questions. Can this monitoring and sanctioning system, whatever you want to call it, have undesirable effects, actually increasing the behavior it was designed to decrease? And was this because of ethical fading? That is, did it change the type of decision with which individuals felt that they were faced, such that they were less likely to see the ethical implications? So we ran a series of studies. This is a very, very condensed version of one. We asked people to assume that they were a manufacturer in an industry which produced VS1, a toxic gas. The environmentalists were not happy about this, and so there was some movement underfoot. They were going to start to lobby for legislation requiring 100% use of the scrubbers, which cleaned up the gas, and then would require also some compliance afterwards. Manufacturers in this industry got nervous about this. They knew that was going to be expensive to fight them in court. They knew there was probabilities, but the eventual outcome was not going to be good for them, and there's going to be all these costs associated with compliance. And so they kind of got together and said, you know what? Let's voluntarily run our scrubbers 80%. This is going to be worse for us than now, which is we're doing nothing, but certainly better for us than this alternative. They were then told, they were put into one of two conditions. They were told, hey, there's going to be either no inspections or enforcements, this is up to you. Or they were told, you know what, there's going to be a 5% chance that you're caught, and if it is, the fine is going to be $50,000, which was somewhat negligible. I can talk about strong sanctions too. Our belief is that most of these systems either start out weak because it's expensive, or they become weak, and we know that from reactance theory and Bob Cialdini's work, that eventually people find ways around them. Note that what we're predicting flies in the face of pure economic theory, and that is what we're predicting is that by attaching a fine to an undesirable behavior, reneging and not running your scrubbers like you promised you would, that we're actually going to see an increase in that behavior. Pure economic theory would say, hey, it's a slightly less attractive behavior because it's got this fine associated with it. So either you're going to see a decrease in the behavior or nothing because it's so weak. And we're actually arguing the reverse, and that is that you're actually see more of it. And the reason for that is because of the type of decision that this situation puts you in. To get at that, we asked individuals if you had to choose one description, how would you describe it? Personal, business, ethical, environmental, legal, other. I mean, it was interesting to us that only two people, everybody but two, chose business and ethical, which there was a lot more on the environment, a lot more on the legal. So focusing on those two, what we found is that people were less likely to keep their promise, more likely to renege and not run their scrubbers in the fine condition than in the no fine condition, and that the reason for that, which fully mediated for those of you interested in that statistic, the reason for that was because of the type of decision with which individuals felt that they were faced. A majority of people in the no fine condition saw it as an ethical decision. A majority of people in the fine condition saw it as a business decision. And we can imagine the different processing that occurs within each of those. In the business frame, I'm saying to myself, what's the probability I'm going to get caught? What's the likelihood? What's the fine? Okay, well, gosh, in this case, it seems to make sense. You know, I mean, it seems to make sense to take that risk. The ethical frame, I'm saying, what should I do? I may not choose to behave ethically, but I'm at least asking that question. But we don't ever allow people to get there if, in fact, we're erasing the ethics from that decision. So that just gives you an example of ethical fading. I think there's all kinds of psychological contributors to ethical fading. There's also some institutional contributors, standard compliance focus, the way we describe our responsibilities, the way we describe our decisions. This is a great example, unfortunately, an unfortunate one. from Hitler's regime. After the war, Speer admitted that by labeling himself an administrator of Hitler's plans, he convinced himself that issues relating to human beings were not part of his job. And so that begs the question of how do we describe jobs and responsibilities that we're subject to? We can also look at the way we describe decisions that we make. Do we call them, firing or right-sizing? Do we call them dead civilians or collateral damage? Do we call it nuclear waste or sunshine units? This last one actually came from a project, unfortunately I'm not quite as involved in anymore, with John Darley and Mitt Reagan and Elizabeth Chambliss and Avani Mehta on law firm cultures. And what I noticed, we just interviewed, just trying to understand culture and impact on decisions, very, very broad. And what I noticed when I was reading some of these transcripts is people would say, oh, that was a judgment call. And I thought, well, duh. I mean, really all decisions we make, right, are judgment calls. But that word is used to describe a judgment call that could potentially now be seen as unethical. We certainly don't use that word to describe something I feel very good about. So I would say, how do we cleanse out the ethics in the way that we talk about our responsibilities, and how do we do it from a policy standpoint as well? So just to end, I think with that, our policies and I think our interventions kind of exhibit a psychological ignorance, and we really need to think how they encourage ethical fading and unintended unethical behavior. Thank you.
All right, welcome to the afternoon session, the second half of the Foundation's session on institutional corruption. Our first speaker this afternoon is Jim Yulman from NYU. Jim is an old friend. I've known him for many, many years. He's the master of the study of inferences. How do we go from what we see in a behavior to making dispositional judgments about people? How do we go from watching something simple, like somebody painting something, to deciding that there's something about them that's artistic, and so on. So that's what he's done most of his work on, and he asked lots of interesting questions about the consequences of such inferences, especially for decisions that we make about the cause of behaviors lying within people rather than in the situation outside. But he's done us a great favor today by talking to us about the role of money in corruption. And to do this, he will summarize for you a variety of different lines of research from the broader field of social psychology as it's relevant to the topic today. So come, Jim.
Most of I really don't know anything about corruption except what lay people know about corruption. I've never had a lot of opportunities to become corrupt or corrupt others.
Don't fool yourself.
Well, maybe I am fooling myself, yes. And as the talks were going on earlier, before lunch, this morning in particular, but as well later, the psychologist talking about it, I was thinking of other areas in social psychology that are relevant to this whole conference, and you can think of a lot of them. What I want to do is talk about, in particular, some of the changes that happen to people's mental states, their mindsets, their frame of reference, when money confronts them. There's some interest, it's not research that I've done, but other people have done, but that's what came to mind when I was thinking about corruption. But I could think of several other areas of research that I'm not going to talk about, but let me just mention them since I don't have them on the slides. And one of them, there was a lot of talk about institutional corruption, personal corruption, changing institutional norms. I know there's research on the effects of leaders on institutions, corrupt practices. In particular, there's work on sexual harassment that shows that the attitudes of the people in charge of organizations, at the head of organizations, affects the extent to which sexual harassment takes place. There's work on how you perceive other people, impressions that you form, the kind of stuff that I do, but I'm not going to talk any more about it than this. That has to do with simply their personal appearance. People who have baby faces, who look like children, are seen as more trustworthy, even if they're adults. A long line of research on that. There's research on norms in organizations, but anyway, I'm not going to talk about any of that. So let me move on to unconscious social inferences, which is the kind of thing I do in the context of forming impressions of other people. Influencing others, there's nothing really mysterious in some ways about influencing others. So I've got this mesmerism slide up here just because that's the way people used to think about it. It does happen without our awareness. It happens unconsciously, but it doesn't happen that way. There's a whole field of research. Here's a book that I edited with some other people that talks about a lot of that research in all kinds of other areas. So it's an active area. And what Mahzarin was referring to earlier was my work when she was talking about forming impressions of people. The kind of work that I do is I present people with stimuli like this, a picture of a person, a behavioral description. I ask them to read it for a memory test that's coming later. Sometimes we just ask them to take a look at it because we're going to be using this material later on in the study. So they take a look at it, and then we use various dependent variables to find out what kinds of inferences they've made unconsciously. That is, in the sense that they didn't know they were making inferences, they have no awareness of inferences they've made, they had no goal to make inferences, but they do it anyway. And it's unconscious, not in the sense that it's subliminal, because you see everything is there, but you don't know what you're doing with it. Well, money has a similar similar effects, lots of effects. Money as a stimulus has been studied over the past 10 years by a number of people. And they do it simply by presenting people, priming people with money, images of money, or they have money out on the table in the experiment, or not in the control condition. People come in, they're exposed to money, so they're primed with the concept. And it puts them in a different frame of mind. They think about things differently, and that's what I'm going to tell you about. And that frame of mind affects the kinds of inferences that they make. I mean, money has lots of uses. There are lots of ways of interpreting it. Money is really useful. I'm grateful to those who invented it. It makes all kinds of commerce possible. It is a useful social tool, but it also has other meanings, and those meanings are what I want to talk about. A little more about priming. Let's back up a little bit about priming. You can prime all kinds of things. There's some interesting research that looks at, well, there's a lot of research on the differences between the way Easterners and Westerners think about all kinds of things. Causality in social interaction, for example. Those of us in the West tend to think of actors as the agents who are causes and responsible for things that happen. People in the East are more attuned to situational determinants, context, things of that kind. It's talked about in terms of independence, interdependence, individualism, collectivism. There's a line of research that's been done most convincingly in Hong Kong, where you just bring biculturals from Hong Kong who know both British and or British/American culture and Chinese culture. You bring them into the lab, and either the lab is decorated with Western things like the Statue of Liberty and Marilyn Monroe and the Capitol building, things like that, or dragons, the Great Wall of China. No word is said about it. They just come in and they do the tasks on which these differences occur, have been shown that people exhibit depending on which culture they're from. If you're bicultural, you can switch. People do this kind of frame switching just on the basis of things that are on the wall that are incidentally available. And they either act like Easterners or Westerners, same people. So priming is powerful, and it does put people in different frames of mind. The frame of mind depends on what associations you have with and beliefs you have about the things that are priming you. One of the things that people are worried about these days in this literature is, somebody was telling me, it doesn't matter who, somebody was telling me yesterday, I think, that her theory is that everything can be primed, that primes prime everything, and there's a real question as to what are the limits of priming effects, and how can you predict what things are going to be primed by particular crimes. That's a big open question, but there's certainly priming is a major phenomenon that we study. Money can prime people. And people have beliefs about money. It's sort of like Anne was talking about business frames of reference that you can put people in. They'll think about it differently than if they think it's an ethical problem or if they think it's a community problem. There are bargaining games which you present to people. Either you tell them it's a community game or it's a Wall Street game. Same game, same payoff matrix. They act very differently depending on what label you put on it. Those are primes. So money primes too. So what happens if you prime money? Kathleen Vose has done a lot of this work. This is from an article in Science magazine. You don't need to look at all the numbers, but this was a series of 8 studies in this paper. I'll skip the first 2 since these are enough. These 4 studies were studies in which people were given the opportunity to be helpful. And they were primed with money, or not. There's a control condition. So the money condition is being primed with money. The no money condition is not getting a money prime. And then a number of dependent variables are looked at, depending on what the situation was. So somebody comes in and does this study, and money is, or primes them or not, and then the confederate asks them if they would help them code some data sheets. And so the dependent variable is the number of data sheets that the person volunteers to help them with in the short time that remains before the study is formally over. And in the money condition, they volunteer to help with fewer sheets. They're less generous than in the no money condition. Or you give them an opportunity to spend time helping a peer with a task. Or somebody comes into the room and spills a bunch of pencils on the floor, and you just count the number of pencils the person picks up. They pick up fewer pencils if they've been primed with money than if they haven't. Or you give them an opportunity to donate money that they got from being in the experiment. You pay them in quarters so they have change. You give them an opportunity to donate that money to charity, and they donate less money if money has primed them. Everybody's gotten money, so in some sense everybody's been primed by having money. But the additional prime puts them in a different frame of mind. So it has effects on generosity. It makes people less generous, less helpful. Time, money, pencils, data sheets, an easier way to remember the dependent variables. It also has other effects. People distance themselves from others. This is all, I should say. Most of this was done at the University of Minnesota with undergraduates. I looked at what the student population was. If it were done somewhere else, if people had a different concept of what money is for, I have no doubt that this would be different. So these are Westerners, Minnesotans in arts and science. These are not MBA students. Maybe it would be different. I suspect it would, actually. This set of dependent variables, this set of studies looked at distance in various ways. So you give people a chance to position chairs for the next person in the study to come in and sit with you in. And if people who've been primed with money, put the chairs farther apart. So, or you give people a chance to work together or to work alone. People who've been primed with money would rather work alone. Or you give them a chance to select activities, some of which you can do by yourself, some of which you have to do with other people. They're more likely to select solitary activities if they've been primed with money. So one way of thinking about this is to say that money promotes self-sufficiency, autonomy. Selfish is, I think, too narrow a concept because it has more to do with doing it by yourself as well. Her more recent work, which I heard about at a conference last week, pitted interpretations of autonomy versus indifference. Maybe it is that money is priming indifference. This is that question I mentioned earlier. What are we priming when we're priming? We're getting behavioral effects, but what's going on that's producing these? So is money priming a sense of indifference, self-sufficiency, independence? I've got money, I can do whatever I want, I don't need people, so they're independent? Or does it prime what I would call an egocentric agency. That is, I can do whatever I want. I can be myself. Not only do I not need other people, but other people don't matter. And so she reported a series of studies in which Confederates or others made suggestions to the subjects or gave them commands, or in one clever study, the Confederate mimicked them. There's a lot of research on mimicry that shows that if you mimic other people, salespeople know this. I think it's taught in business schools now. If you mimic other people, they like you more, as long as you're subtle about it. So you don't want it to be interpreted as mocking them. But with all of these things, commands, suggestions that, could you do this? Could you help me out with that? Or how they respond to mimicry. People who've been primed with money are more resistant to commands, they're less likely to take suggestions, and they dislike being mimicked, even if it's subtle, clever mimicry. So it's not mere indifference to others. It's a kind of, in fact, she's got research in these studies that show that concepts of threat get activated when you make suggestions to people. So it's a sense of autonomy that people develop that they try to protect and to keep other influences from encroaching on their freedom. I hate that word, it's been abused. But that's how she describes it, a longing for freedom. I'd rather call it a kind of egocentric agency, that I'm going to do whatever I want to do, no matter what. So money has effects on individual actors, and there's other work as well, but I think this is some of the best. So why do I call this culture? I told the title of this talk is A Culture of Greed. I never use words like that. Feels preachy to me, but I think it fits here. So why call it a culture? Well, because I think it does depend on beliefs that are shared and that are supported by the social institutions and by the acquaintances and the practices that we engage in day-to-day basis. That's what culture is, in my understanding. This is a picture I got off of Google Images of an economics class. And there's some interesting research that Frank and others have done that shows that taking economics courses makes you more, less generous. So in that sense, we're talking about shared beliefs, shared knowledge. Rational self-interest is what people learn in economics classes, and other places too. It's not just you learn that from watching Republican debates. That's the only way to behave, is to act as a rational actor, which we now know from hearing Anne and Eldar. People are not. Anyway, that's what's stressed in a lot of economics courses, as well as in lots of other places, and I would contend in our culture at large. So there's interesting data that supports this notion that economics in particular has a special impact. More economic professors give nothing to charity than other professors in arts and science. Economic majors defect more, that is, don't cooperate, play competitively in a prisoner's dilemma game, than do non-econ majors. There's the reference for this, and this study that I want to describe in a little more detail, where they looked at people's responses to an honesty survey, both before and after. So these are change scores. This isn't that people who take different classes are different to begin with. There's self-sorting, that's a problem. People are not assigned randomly to take these courses. So you've got to control for that. So they measure it before and after. So there are two econ classes. Class A emphasizes more game theory, rational self-interest. Class B was more on international development. It would certainly talk about those concepts, but in a different, broader context. The third class was an astronomy class, which doesn't talk about any of this, doesn't even talk about people, except perhaps maybe astronomers. So they gave the same survey at the beginning and at the end, and what this messy graph, which I just picked up from the article, shows is the extent to which people became less honest over the course of the semester. The higher the bar, the worse it is if honesty is a virtue in your mind. So the microeconomics class that talks a lot about game theory and rational self-interest is the bar at the left on each of these clusters. The one that talks more about developmental economics, underdeveloped countries, is in the middle, and the astronomy class is on the right. On average, putting them all together, there are significant differences in the amount of change in honesty between all of these pairs. So econ comes off better or worse than astronomy, but even within economics, you can pinpoint the kinds of things to some extent that are responsible for this sort of effect. So why do well, yeah, you might say to yourself, nobody in here would say this to themselves, but as I was trying to put this talk together, I thought one might say to oneself, aren't all cultures like this? Don't people believe in exchange and rational self-interest and all of those sorts of things? Well, not at all. And if you're familiar with this book or other work by these authors, Henrik, Boyd, Bowles, etc., Colin Kammerer, Fair, and Gintis, this book reports on a whole series of studies that were done in a variety of non-Western cultures, many of which had very little contact with Western society and Western markets. It simply took the kinds of games that economists and social psychologists are fond of having people play to understand how they behave and what their norms are and so on and so forth. The dictator game, the ultimatum game that was mentioned before that Anne talked about, prisoner's dilemma game, into these cultures, had people play them in the native language, and see whether or not, do they behave like college sophomores? And they don't. They're really wildly different. So to the extent that you believe that people's behavior in games of this sort depends on the payoff matrix and the structure of the game and the situation, that's one of the things social psychologists tell themselves all the time, depends on the situation, behavior changes on the basis of the situation. Well, this shows very clearly that the situation is much broader than the payoff matrix, the game that you present people, and any kind of calculation of interest, even if people did that in some rational way. College sophomores don't do it, but people in other cultures do it differently. It's not clear from this book. I found this book really frustrating. It's not clear what people are doing, but it is clear that they're doing it very differently from one place to another. There's some suggestion that cultures that have been exposed to markets and understand market exchanges are different from other cultures that don't have market economies at all. So all I want to point out is that it's broader than just the payoff matrix, the game itself. It has to do with your assumptions and your practices and your social relations. It always reminds me of when I was teaching my 3-year-old. She's grown up since, she's a lot older now, but I was teaching her to play chess. And so she sort of rehearsed, said, so the knight moves this way, and so we went through a few moves, and she sort of had that, and then we were going through so you capture the piece by moving onto the space that it is, and we did a few of those, and then she said, okay, you can have all these pieces. She just shoved them all across the board and gave them to me. Because, I don't know, our relationship was more important than who was capturing whom, or what is this all about anyway? She obviously didn't understand it, but she had a whole different framework, a different culture. And a lot of the interpretations of what people do in these cultures with these kinds of games is based on the kinds of relationships they have. These are small traditional societies, so you don't want to, when you play the dictator game with somebody who's your wife's brother and is this and that, and all these alliances exist, that enters in very much to what you do. So institutions have cultures. I think one of the things you have to do when you're trying to change corruption is think about norms and culture and what practices people engage in. Not just the individual. Well, you all know that because this is about institutional corruption. Culture is a large part of it. They shape behavior, but And money is one of the things that shapes behavior, but it's our interpretation of money. I'm not saying money is bad, but these things can prime people's behavior, the way they think about things. And the primes, even though the primes themselves are in plain sight, they're what is acting as a prime, what the effect of the prime is usually unavailable to the person. That is to say, the effects are unconscious. So that's it.
Thank you, Jim. Our last speaker is John Jost in this session. I've known John as well for many, many years. He became quite famous for writing a paper in which he talked about the differences in the ways in which liberals and conservatives think. Rush Limbaugh and others took offense with John's portrayal of conservatives as relatively more simple-minded. And as not being able to deal with uncertainty. I thought those are the two big differences. There are some others. All right, but what he's going to tell us about today is sort of the core of his work. The best way to describe it is to say that in psychology there have been very important traditions. One that has its basis in the way in which psychoanalytic theory thought about the human being as people who will do anything to protect their ego, to protect the self. And that there are lots of mechanisms that we can trace back to this desire to protect oneself. And then along came a bunch of other kinds of psychologists who said, but look, people do lots of things that are not in their self-interest in order to support their groups. And that's really what's important. It's the group and group identity that is far more important than the ego. And John came along and said, it's not even the group. It is the larger system that we all seek to justify in some very deep way. And he's focused his attention on people who belong to disadvantaged groups, among many others, to look at ways in which people who belong to disadvantaged groups will also themselves play a quite important role in justifying systems that are not in their own interest. So I've asked if he will say a little bit today about that idea and its implications for institutional corruption. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahzarin. I'm not sure I need to give my talk now, but thank you for the introduction. And thank you for inviting me, involving me in this. It's been a fascinating day. I've learned a lot. I'm really happy to be a part of it, and I hope that what I've been thinking about can play some useful role in your thinking about it today, too. Okay, I would say that in the history of Western civilization, it would be difficult to find a greater intellectual authority of ethical behavior than Aristotle. I don't know about you, but I'm not presently holding any illusions that people are going to be reading my works 24 centuries from now, if people are still around reading anyone's works. And yet there are aspects of Aristotle's belief system that strike contemporary audiences as anomalous and obviously wrong-headed, possibly even immoral. His views about women, for example, not good. But even more troubling, I think, is his spirited defense of the institution of slavery as practiced not by him, but by many of his fellow Athenian citizens. How could such a brilliant ethical mind possibly find itself arguing that as brutal and exploitative an institution as slavery was not only necessary, but also just? It's certainly not the case that no one in ancient Greece had ever raised moral objections to slavery. Several philosophers who were contemporaries or predecessors of Aristotle had, in fact, criticized the practice. But Aristotle rejected and even attempted to refute their criticisms. Of course, we can't be sure now why Aristotle defended the institution of slavery. But there's good reason to suspect, I think, that it had something to do with what my colleagues and I have been referring to as system justification. That is, the conscious and unconscious motivation to defend, bolster, and justify existing social, economic, and political institutions and arrangements. So in support of this possibility, the Aristotelian scholar Richard Kraut wrote, "No doubt Aristotle believed that slavery was justified, in part because that was a convenient tenet for him to hold. Had he come to the opposite conclusion, he he would have been forced to announce to the Greek world that its political institutions, which he greatly valued, however much he also criticized them, rested on resources that could not be justly acquired or used. The all-too-human tendency to avoid upheavals of thought and revolutions in social practice certainly played a role here. In order for Aristotle to have arrived at the sincere conviction that slavery was just, his social world had to present itself to him in a way that supported that thesis. It seems likely, I think, that social, cognitive, and motivational factors led Aristotle to the conclusion that some individuals are natural slaves and others are natural masters, and that both slaves and masters benefit from the system of slavery. These beliefs helped Aristotle and his fellow Athenians to feel better about their own society and to rationalize away any guilt, dissonance, or negative affect that they might have otherwise felt. But it also contributed to the perceived legitimacy and stability of the institution of slavery. And this leads me to wonder which problems associated with our social, economic, and political systems will be completely obvious to all of our ancestors, but that we're motivated to ignore, tolerate, downplay, defend, or rationalize. There are, for instance, persistent black-white racial disparities in education, healthcare, the legal system, many other domains of life, gender disparities at work and at home, social exclusion and prejudice against immigrants and minorities, including gays and lesbians, religious, ethnic, and other forms of violence, problems posed by global climate change, not affecting everyone equivalently, the disturbing financial relationships that exist between corporations and the super rich on one hand, and politicians who are supposed to be representing all of us on the other, relationships that are documented so well in Professor Lessig's book. And something that's really only quite recently inspired genuine protest here, stark increasing economic inequality under capitalism. There are many different ways of looking at income inequality in the US, but they all tell pretty much the same story. Over the last 30 years, the rich have gotten much, much richer, and the middle and working classes have either stayed the same or gotten worse. Between 1976 and 2007, the inflation-adjusted hourly wage declined by more than 7%, and yet the share of total income going to the top 1% nearly tripled during the same time period. It would be difficult, if not impossible, to find any substantive justice principle, such as equity or merit, equality or need, that would be consistent with this degree of inequality. So it's probably not about justice. Some years ago, Mahzarin and I proposed a theory suggesting that just as individuals are motivated to think positively of themselves and to the groups to which they belong, all of us are motivated to think positively, at least as positively as we can, about the social, economic, and political systems that affect us. Among other things, this motivation leads us to deny and rationalize away the moral and other failings of these systems and to derogate potential alternatives to them. Dozens or perhaps now hundreds of studies have shown that people are indeed prone to a variety of system-serving biases, such as using stereotypes and evaluations to justify social and economic outcomes, preferring ideologies and belief systems that maintain rather than challenge perceptions of fairness and legitimacy, and even distorting information and misremembering reasons for power differences, economic success versus failure, climate change, all in directions that are favorable rather than unfavorable to the maintenance of the status quo. Why on earth would we do this when perpetuating the status quo poses negative externalities in the economic language usefully adapted by Professor Lessig? Well, after 15 years of research, we think that it's because, at least in part because, defending and bolstering the status quo satisfies existential needs to manage anxiety, fear, and threat, epistemic needs for order, certainty, and control, and relational needs to affiliate with and share reality with valued others, most of whom have system justification motives of their own. So consistent with this theory, we find that the endorsement or the opportunity to endorse, and sometimes it's the endorsement, sometimes it's just the opportunity to endorse or reminders of endorsement of system justifying beliefs and ideologies serve the palliative function of increasing positive affect and decreasing negative affect, both for those who are advantaged and, as Mahzarin was suggesting, more paradoxically perhaps, for those who are disadvantaged by the status quo as well, at least in the short term. There may be long-term costs to doing so. That's another story. It also undermines moral outrage, the desire for social change, and willingness to engage in collective action. But like virtually all other sources of human motivation, the strength of system justification tendencies varies according to dispositional or personality factors, as well as situational or environmental factors. So we think that our perspective helps to explain why some individuals are drawn to conservative outlooks that tend to vindicate the social order, as Edmund Burke so famously put it, whereas others are drawn to progressive outlooks that seek to challenge, criticize, or in various ways reform or improve upon the status quo. It also helps to explain why virtually all of us, with the possible exception of Noam Chomsky, you can tell me, can be drawn into defending and rationalizing the shortcomings of one system or another, including perhaps for academics, the academic system itself, the journal review process, the hierarchy among colleges and universities, and on and on. But one important situational factor that we've identified in our research is system dependence, which tends to magnify these system-serving biases. And so I was fascinated by Professor Lessig's discussion of dependence corruption. So he described, for instance, being a parent of a young child, which I am now, and hearing rumors about unsafe plastics being used in baby spoons, bottles, pacifiers, and so on, and responding, I think, the way most people would, which is he thought to himself, obviously, the plastic is safe. We spend billions running agencies designed to ensure the safety of the stuff that we put in our mouths. How could it possibly be that the safety of something a baby puts into his mouth could still be in doubt? And so I would say that it's our utter dependency on governments, corporations, or other institutions that leaves us few psychological options but to trust in their benevolence and their competence and their fairness, and to develop, as Professor Lessig says, a strong resistance to breaking the pattern of dependency, so it becomes self-perpetuating. And so along these lines, my colleagues and I, including Jojannika van der Toorn and Tom Tyler, have found that feelings of dependence on authority figures, including supervisors at work, governmental decision-making bodies, and police officers, are positively associated with the perception that those authorities are legitimate, even after adjusting for lots of things like outcome favorability, even procedural justice things. Dependence contributes and fosters perceptions of legitimacy. In experimental work, we've also found that simply asking people to write about a time in which they felt powerless and under the control of someone else led them to score higher on a general or diffuse measure of system justification, which includes items like these. In general, you find society to be fair. In general, the American political system operates as it should. American society needs to be radically restructured. It's a reverse scored item. The US is the best country in the world to live in, and so on. Most policies serve the greater good. Okay. This month's Journal of Personality and Social Psychology contains an article by Steve Shepard and my former student, Aaron Kay, in which they demonstrate, using both survey and laboratory methods, that when people feel uninformed or unable to understand complex issues concerning, for example, the environment, energy concerns, energy technology, and the economy, they feel more dependent on the government. And these feelings of dependence on the government, in turn, foster increased trust of governmental authorities to do what's right. And this trust, then, causes people to actively avoid learning about important information that is either negative or potentially negative. In other words, ignorance breeds dependence, which breeds system justification, which breeds motivated avoidance, which breeds continued ignorance. Jeffrey Pfeffer, a professor in the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University, has argued that system justification theory can help to explain the lack of outrage following the 2008 financial crisis. So he started this by citing a public opinion poll in which 49% of Americans reported a negative view of Goldman Sachs. And he points out that the question should not be, why did 49% of Americans have a negative opinion about Goldman Sachs? Why do 51% still hold a positive view of Goldman Sachs? In light of the fact that Goldman Sachs had bet against the bonds that it was selling, gave misleading information to the agencies rating those bonds, obviously contributed to huge financial losses for lots and lots of people, took governmental bailouts, paid themselves handsome bonuses, stopped giving out loans to customers, and so on and so on. Okay, he suggests that research on system justification processes helps us to understand why there's less anger and pressure to change regulatory oversight than might be expected by the economic disaster visited on millions of Americans by events not of their own doing. To feel good about America and its system, people make sense of what happened in ways that do not undermine the legitimacy of the existing status order, including the huge salaries earned by people working in finance. A team of organizational researchers has also proposed that system justification theory can help to explain why employees frequently derogate whistleblowers who are seemingly acting in the best interests of others in the organization by attempting to reinstate appropriate ethical standards. They argue that the whistleblower poses a potentially strong threat to the self-concepts of those who are behaving unethically, to the group images of those who are benefiting, and to a prosperous status quo born out of illicit activity. And so in response to these threats at the self-group and system levels, many employees respond defensively and angrily and are strongly motivated to attack internal critics of the system rather than attacking problems that are endemic to the system in the first place. Okay. So I suspect that there are many ways in which system justification motivation contributes to tolerance of institutional corruption, if not institutional corruption itself. But just a few sort of concluding remarks, comments. System justifying beliefs have implications for individuals' sense of entitlement or deservingness, as well as perceptions of legitimacy. A very clever experiment by Laurie O'Brien and her colleagues showed that simply unscrambling sentences, statements that are system justifying, such as the system is fair, versus control sentences, had the effect of increasing the amount of money that men felt that they deserved to be paid for their work, but it decreased women's sense of entitlement, what they thought they deserved for their work. So once again, in this case, simply priming people with system justifying statements or thoughts maintains or even exacerbates inequality. So my hunch is that many instances of institutional corruption occur because perpetrators are able to find rationalizations for their own behavior, the behavior of other group members, and for a status quo that may not be illegal, but obviously in many of these examples is ethically dubious. So I would say watch out for the dangerous conjunction of self-group and system-justifying beliefs and ideologies. A case in point may be the CEO of Goldman Sachs, who secured enormous bonuses for himself and his fellow executives in 2011, after the company posted huge losses in the third quarter of that year, laid off thousands of workers, and faced allegations of ethical misconduct. In 2009, he proudly proclaimed that he was doing God's work, that executives at Goldman Sachs were very important for society, and that the banking industry creates a virtuous cycle of jobs, growth, and wealth. So he pulled off the ego, group, and system justification trifecta. Okay, finally, from a system justification perspective, I'm not so sure that loss of public trust is part of the problem, rather than, let's say, a precondition for coming up with a reasonable solution. And I think that this point may be consistent with what Dennis Thompson and Robert Putnam may have been suggesting earlier this morning. Certainly we don't want to promote cynicism for its own sake, but given that moral outrage motivates collective action and social change, whereas unrealistically positive views of the system, a kind of motivated gullibility perhaps, tend to inhibit change, it may actually be a good thing when the system justification bubble finally bursts. Thank you.
So can I ask if the four of you will come sit here, and we will take any and all questions up until 2:45, so we have a half hour for them. I know that while people have been thinking about ethics, about morality for a very long time, the work that you heard is really fairly new work. And it's only in the last 20, 30 years at most that we've had the technology, the theories, literally the ways of asking questions that have produced this body of knowledge. And so, since most of you in the room are not psychologists, I would say it would be very helpful to us if you could, from the perspective of your discipline, ask what these data now mean for existing ways of thinking. Because that's, I think, where this work will need to meet with the questions about what we think of as institutional corruption and what the solutions for it ought to be. So, John, Eldar, and Jim, and Anne. Okay, so let's see. Francis had a question, and then I saw a hand in the back, and then so let's take these three. Yes. Yeah.
Hi, I'm a philosopher, so I have some questions about some of the concepts that you used. Philosophers are used to distinguishing between intention and foresight, and you're obviously distinguishing between the intentional in the sense of the conscious and the unconscious. So when you talk about intentions, you say things, or that a behavior is unintended, you seem to be focusing on the fact that people are not aware of what they're doing. Philosophers want to draw a different distinction, which talks about the difference between knowingly doing something, foreseeing that you're going to do it, and acting despite that, but not intending it. So if I know that as I rush to the hospital I'm going to bump into someone on the way, it's not that I don't foresee that I will do that, I'm unconscious. It's just that I don't intend to do it. I foresee it as a side effect. So I just want to point out that there is this difference in drawing this, in the way you're using these words sometimes. And so it strikes me when we keep in mind these two different ways of, conscious, unconscious, intention, foresight. Do you really want to exclude the possibility that there are unconscious, goal-directed intentions? No, because you're shaking your head, Professor Jost, no. But yes, when you described unconscious, or when you described not intending, you spoke about no deliberate conscious intention, right? But the point is that will describe unconsciousness. But it may be that there are unconscious intentions. So when people go to the economics class and they form these, you call them priming to motivation, right? It may be that there are unconscious goals that they now have, unconscious intentions. And I didn't know, the languages you were using, it seemed to almost conceptually exclude that possibility. And you don't want to do that. And then I think some of the things that you put on the board would have to be rewritten. The question I had for Professor Tenbrunsel, I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing it correctly, is that you spoke about ethical fading, but it seemed to me again that, from a philosopher's point of view, and you asked us to speak from our own, that there was some fading involved in the presentation of your, at least the last slide. I saw you translating, for example, collateral damage as really what it is civilian deaths. But that fades out the distinction between foreseen deaths and intended deaths. And the whole idea of talking about collateral as opposed to intended harm is to say that sometimes action where you foresee harm, civilian deaths, I take it the damage is a word that is not making clear that there are deaths, but it's not enough to translate collateral damage into civilian deaths, because there is a distinction between deaths that may be caused foreseeing that they will occur, and deaths that you intend to bring about, as, for example, in a terrorist activity. And that failure to do the translation properly shows me that there was fading, which you would call ethical fading. because you haven't yet grasped a distinction that some people think is ethically important. So I'm just saying that when a philosopher looks at some of the concepts and some of the translations, it seems to me that there are some issues that we would have with the way you're describing the phenomenon.
Why don't we, I think the first is going to be fairly easy to answer. The answer is there must be a misunderstanding because psychologists certainly talk about unconscious goals. So maybe we can take care of that way?
You better look at all your screens. There was a constant tendency.
These were 15-minute presentations,
Okay.
But the literature really does contain
So
lots
there
and lots
may
of
be
evidence.
intentions. It's not that some of these people are not intending to do wrong. There are unconscious intentions to do wrong. That's not been eliminated.
Yes, it's not eliminated, although I think many of us are actually, we were setting that aside today to talk about people who may have no intention of doing wrong. And to us, that is a much more interesting question.
But it's not captured
Because
by
it's-
unconscious.
yeah,
That's
right.
all I'm saying.
Okay, and do you want to answer
Yeah,
the
I
question?
can give a
Yeah.
quick answer to that. In no way was I meaning to capture that as the concept of ethical fading.
That's why I
right?
said,
Right.
that's why
So-
I said there was an ethical issue.
So the
faded.
question is in both of those cases, to me, intended or unintended, conscious or unconscious, is there ethical fading that comes in whatever term would actually be used? So I was more interested, my own personal interest, is to what extent does the use of labels and terms lead me to not see the ethics? And how we define that ethics, we could certainly, I agree, as psychologists become more fine-grained if that's our purpose. But I wouldn't say that was necessary. Just in general, how do labels change how we perceive our behavior?
Right, including the label of civilian deaths as being
Absolutely.
sufficient.
Absolutely.
Good.
Okay, let's take a question. Yeah, the one.
Yeah, my name is Dan Newman from Maplight. We're an organization that reveals money's influence on politics. And my question is for Professor Jost. You talked about this cycle of ignorance, which leads to system justification, is ignorance, this negative cycle, and at the end talked about the moral outrage, which you felt was a positive development, like basically what brings about change, or at least according to some research. So my question is, what are the most effective strategies, now that you know about this negative cycle, for actually getting people involved in changing the system?
It sounds like I should be asking you that question based on what you do. I mean, I guess I have several thoughts about that. But from let's say a kind of system justification perspective, I think the idea is that people tend to respond defensively to criticisms and threats to the status quo, to the extent that the status quo, or the system that they believe in, is providing them with epistemic, existential, and relational kinds of benefits. And so I guess what I would say is that unless, I guess one of two possibilities. One is the present system ceases to satisfy those epistemic, existential, and relational needs, so it provides no stability whatsoever, no ability for the individual to predict where his or her next meal is coming from, and so on. No safety, no sense of certainty, security, any of that, and all of one's friends are also feeling similarly. And maybe in some sense, there's a plausible story you could tell that would add a kind of social psychological dimension to, let's say, our understanding of the Arab Spring last year. So that's one thing. The second thing, I think, in a society that's obviously a lot more stable and fixed like ours, I guess I would say that to avoid the defensive response, you still need to address those kinds of psychological underlying motives. So provide something else that will do a better job of meeting those needs.
There's a question somewhere here in the middle, or since your hand is up and there's a microphone close to you.
Question for Professor Shafir. You displayed those preposterous questions for welfare recipients. They had to fill out the form that a lot of us would, food stamps, yeah. So a lot of us would have trouble with those. Now, to explain this, you made a reference to the way that economists think about rationality. Let me give an alternative explanation. I just wonder what you think of it. There was a study recently, I don't think it's been published yet, trying to find out whether the degree to which states succeeded in signing up poor people for programs like Medicaid has some correlation with the sort of prevailing political ethos in terms of the kinds of attitudes toward the welfare state that tended to be exhibited by public officials that got the most votes. And the answer is positive, yes. The less sympathy there was for the welfare state, the lower the sign-up rates, and the opposite was true too. So let's go back to these questions which seem calculated to deter usage. Suppose that they're the answer, what would be the question? Well, if the question is how can we keep undeserving ingrates from draining the public treasury, this is perfectly rational, beautifully suited. And if the question is how can we make sure that people don't suffer pain and suffering when we can relieve that at low expense, then of course it was just terrible. So this sort of suggests that looking at it from that point of view, really the question is what are they trying to do? Now, if that does explain it best, then do we want to say that there's corruption here in some sense that something is not working according to the purpose of what it is that we're talking about? Well, it depends on what your purpose is. You'd have to say that somehow the whole political ethos of the state was corrupt if they didn't have sympathy for the poor and didn't want to bend over backward to make sure that each person who needed it got what they needed. That would be the highest priority. But it seems a little odd to talk about corruption in that context.
I think I agree with almost everything you said. So I said initially that if one assumed this was designed with an attempt to lower take-up, those offensive forms, then I think it works. I said, I'm not cynical enough to assume that's what was done, but if it's done, then it's working. I agree with you that, we can question the ethical values driving the policy, but I agree it's not corrupt in the sense that I intended it to be, which is corrupt based on corrupting assumptions that make us do things badly. Now, there are other examples you can look at. Here's a simple example that's giving me an ulcer for the last 10 years until Obama came along. Citibank was allowed to send you your credit card statement and a suggestion, 12th of June as payday. And you'd accept, and it was a Sunday, and they'd charge you $40 for being late. Now, $40 for you is annoying. $40 for some of my subjects is a very different week, and it's one line of code to avoid it. Now, I don't even care about Citibank. The fact that the government allowed that to be legal, that to me is a corrupted system, because unless you think the government wants to hurt the poor more, it's driven by the assumption that if $40 are important enough to me, I'll make sure not to pay them. And that's a wrong assumption. I'm busy, my child has a stomach ache, I don't know how to pay for dinner, and I say okay to Citibank. And now my week has changed. So I think there are a lot of examples of that sort where, in fact, it's pretty easy to convince yourself that the evil intention wasn't there. It was sort of a very innocent misunderstanding of what drives people into bad moments or not that could be easily regulated in this case.
I really disagree and would love to talk to you about it. I don't want to.
So
Good.
your disagreement then is with a much broader definition
No,
that the Safra Center is working with, because the two components of Lessig's definition of corruption would allow his example to fit. Because the first is this institution doing what it needs to do? Is it serving its mission? And the answer to that question would be no, it's not. And the second part of it is, does the public have trust in the system? The answer to that is no. So your difficulty with this is legitimate, but it's a much broader. It's not with that one study. It would be with the definition that we're sort of using as a working definition across a whole variety of projects. But we can come back to Ian, and then yes.
So Mahzarin, I wonder if this broader definition of corruption might be able to encompass some of the ways that term is used by Republicans with regard to the process and the impacts of do-gooder interventions. So they'll talk about the corrupting influence of regulation of union dues. They'll talk about, John, the corrupting dependency of welfare with the very idea that it's you're trying to make the recipients dependent in a way, and the leaders of representing the dependents want to keep their jobs. You tell the same story about the corrupting influence on Native Americans on reservations keep them poor and dependent so they can keep their jobs. Your examples don't seem to encompass the way the term is used by half of Americans.
I'm not sure how much you were influenced by Mahzarin's introduction about my research on psychological differences between liberals and conservatives that were criticized but not read by Rush Limbaugh and others. But I think that's actually not true. I think that I would be sympathetic to at least some of those examples and to running the simulation through what implications does it have for system justification theory. So, yeah.
My name is Min Lee. I'm from the Department of Political Science at Brown. I have a question for Professor Tenbrunsel. I was absolutely fascinated by your discussion of ethical fading, the idea that before people make a decision, they think they're going to act ethically. During the decision, they don't act ethically. And after the decision, they rather self-flatteringly think that they did act morally. So I wanted to ask you about the political implications of your work. First, is there any evidence suggesting that people in political power might actually be more subject to the phenomenon of ethical fading? And secondly of all, I wanted to ask about your studies of ethical fading, because it seems that in many of those studies, the decision-making is taking place on a largely individual basis. But politically, oftentimes, decisions are made collectively, and there's a whole line of research in democratic theory called deliberative democracy, done by people like Mark Warren and Dennis Thompson on the first panel, that suggests that when decisions are made after a process of reason-giving and criticism, that those decisions might be more ethical. So is there any work or research to suggest that perhaps ethical fading could be countered by a process of deliberation or of political leaders meeting the people whose lives are actually affecting and being subject to critical questioning, criticism from those people?
So lots of good aspects, and I hope my answer captures them. To the point of whether or not politicians would be more likely to be subject to this, I don't know that for sure, but I have started to think about factors that might impact us. Certainly we know that those in power, there's a lot of great work, tend to not seek information as much as others tend to hold higher visions of self-confidence. So to the extent you could make a pretty straight corollary, I think they might be more likely to fall prey to ethical fading, more likely to not see the ethical implications of their actions. Certainly motivated reasoning would come into play too. So the more motivated I am not to see it, the less likely I am. In terms of groups, that research, which I'm unfortunately not familiar with, seems to be contradictory to a lot of the work on groupthink. So, which would suggest that oftentimes when I'm in a group, we reinforce each other's beliefs, particularly I would think to the extent to which the holding up of those beliefs support the system of which we're a larger part. So what would be maybe the most interesting is to say what are the kind of boundary factors or the contingency factors that dictate when group work leads to less ethical fading and when it doesn't. So I have not studied at the group level. And there you can get into kind of diversity, divergence of opinions, comfort. The only other thought that I had that I really, weirdly enough, because I gave a longer talk on this yesterday, is in some sense I think there might be a reverse kind of counterintuitive aspect of this, and that is the more trusting more trustworthy I am, the less likely others may be to interpret my gray behavior as bad, right? Because I'm I'm a good person, right? I try to be good. And as a result, I may be less likely to get feedback that what I'm doing is unethical or that this is because people may be, hey, it's a gray area, so I'm sure they know. And as a result, trustworthy people may actually maybe, this is just the thought that it may be long-term, be more likely to fall prey over time to ethical fading because they aren't getting the appropriate feedback. But all untested, all just existing in my mind.
This is a question for Jim Uleman, and it's a question about the connection between two ideas that you sort of link together, that is the impact of culture and the evidence from priming. There are, for sure, large cultural differences across the world and across the United States in degrees of trust and altruism Indeed, one of the most striking findings in this field is so striking that I think I'll just take a second to describe it. If you rank all American ethnic groups by how trusting the members of those ethnic groups are, Swedes up at the top, Swedish Americans up at the top, Nigerian Americans down at the bottom, that's sort of what it looks like. And then you rank all the countries in the world by their level of social trust. Sweden happens to be up at the top, Nigeria happens to be at the bottom. Those two rank orders are essentially identical, and you should find that so startling as to be almost unbelievable. Because the people in the American groups, the last time that they had a direct connection with Sweden or Nigeria was on average 100 years ago. So how could that possibly be if these cultural differences in trust and in altruism and so on were not incredibly stable? To the extent that we know anything about long-term measures of these differences, they're very stable. And it happens we know about Minnesota, which is where the priming study was done. And Minnesota is the most trusting state in America. On average, I'm doing this from memory, but I believe I'm about right. 60 to 65% of Minnesotans say that most people can be trusted, compared to 20% of Louisianans who say that most people can be trusted. So those happen to be the outliers. So now that's the basis of the question. Assuming that most of those Minnesota undergraduates were from Minnesota, and that's a safe assumption, they're coming from a culture that has been for a long time, and probably from ethnic groups that have been for a very long time, high trust and highly altruistic. And then somehow, by just leaving a dollar bill on the tray, you can erase 200 years of culture. That's the part I don't quite understand. Because those are all different. The differences you're finding is between two of those Minnesota students who are coming from a high culture, a high trust, high altruism culture. But if you just have a dollar bill lying on the table, if I've understood correctly, suddenly those cultural differences are erased or something. That's what I can't quite understand. How could the priming have such an effect if the cultural differences are so long-standing?
That's one of the things social psychologists are fond of saying, is that everybody except us underestimates the power of situations that people are in. It doesn't erase 200 years of culture and training and all of that, but for the moment, in that situation, at that time, it produces these differences. It's not across the whole scale, but it produces these differences. They're statistically significant, they're reliable, and what's remarkable to me is that this population is different, and that what you're getting them to do, to behave more autonomously, selfishly, however you want to put it, in the face of this cultural heritage, works as well as it does, because I didn't know that cultural background. But this isn't changing them forever. They're going to go out and meet their friends, their families, the cultural milieu that they're in. We're primed all the time. So these are momentary changes, and as soon as you encounter other primes and you're reminded that you're of Swedish heritage, for example, or that you live in Minnesota and you listen to Lake Wobegon, it'll spring back. But cultural differences are pretty long-lasting. I mean, it's hard to change them in the long run, though for the moment you can move things around. Both are true.
Question here, and then I see two hands up there, so we'll take. Oh, okay.
Arthur Applebaum, Kennedy School, and I have a question for Professor Jost. So suppose we took off our psychologist hats for a second, put on our political philosophy hats, that's a hat I like to wear, and ask what would be the, a kind of just and legitimate regime to live under and endorse. It would give some value, of course, to predictability and stability and expectations and safety. I mean, you see how this is going. And we would, unless you were not just a revolutionary, but a kind of perpetual revolutionary, that even after you win the revolution, you then want to have another one, you would value these things, right? How on your
That's what Thomas Jefferson said, actually, yeah.
We want to water the tree of liberty with yes, every so often. But even he didn't think it should be watered daily, right? So what I want to ask is how do you avoid falling into the trap of saying they just have a psychology, we we progressives, we have a philosophy. It seems as if, on your account, you can't distinguish between what are these underlying fear-driven biases and what it simply is an actual political philosophy that you and I think is simply dead wrong. How would you go about evaluating someone who actually was not motivated in the way that you say, but actually simply was philosophically, theoretically mistaken? You surely don't want to say that's impossible, right?
No, I don't. I don't know, I must be doing something wrong to be constantly accused of hypocrisy, so I'll just try to tell you what I think. I'm not trying to say conservatives have psychology and progressives have philosophy. I'm not trying to say that at all. I'm trying to say that the philosophies that we find appealing have some partial basis in underlying psychological needs and motives, and that these needs and motives are pushed around both by relatively chronic, stable personality kinds of factors, including perhaps, who knows, genetic factors, as well as temporary, short-term situational things like priming, like being reminded of 9/11, things that actually we can show in short-term situations do affect our preferences for, if you like, different philosophies. I think this is a fact that social psychologists have been showing again and again. I think we as a society have to grapple with that fact. I think that doesn't mean we stop trying to do political philosophy to find out which is the best one that most of us want to vote for. I think we still need to do that, and I'm in favor of that. And I read a book recently, wrote a book review for I think it's called The American Scientist magazine. The book is called The Fair Society by Peter Corning, where he, I think, makes a pretty compelling, at least to my mind, who knows what role my psychological needs play in my receptiveness to his argument, but there you have it, that I think it's a pretty interesting attempt to develop both a kind of naturalistic, descriptive, evolutionary-based and sophisticated in a social science sense account of what basic human needs are and what we need to have the best possible kind of society for the greatest number and so on, and tries to link that up to various political philosophies that have been proposed. And it's certainly by no means a blueprint for the revolution or whatever, but it's a pretty good attempt to, I think, do what you're asking me to do, which I may not be capable of doing today.
So, thanks. As I was listening to Professor Uleman's introduction, I made a crack about tenure. And then it turned out, one of the examples you used, and I don't know if you're aware of it, but the book that you showed about sociality, two of the authors, Herb Gintis and Sam Bowles, were denied tenure in the economics department at Harvard. And the public explanation would probably have been something like, these guys just don't do serious economics. But I bet the private justification was, we're not going to let a bunch of radical Marxists get tenure in the Harvard economics department. So I don't know if anybody wants to comment about this. I guess one question would be how much of this could be thought about as corruption, institutional corruption, and how much is really just sort of raw power, forms of power, that people just make decisions of what their preferences are and then give justifications. And then the second piece is, I didn't hear the presentation about people applying for welfare, but it's interesting. Apparently people who get food stamps are much more likely to be aware of the fact that they're recipients of government benefits, and people who get the mortgage interest deduction are much less likely to understand that they're getting a government benefit. So that may have an effect on things like system justification. What are you justifying? What aren't you justifying? Do you even know that you're the main beneficiary of housing subsidies are people who get the mortgage interest deduction?
Let's see. There was in between. Next, Jonathan. Before Jonathan, and then Jonathan. Is there a mic there? Oh, sorry, yes. But that's a great I'll definitely, I'll come to you right after that.
Okay, well, I have a slightly different kind of question. I started in the early 70s focusing on institutional corruption in the former Soviet Union and mainly in Central Asia, which makes Italy look like a model of efficiency, I guess, from the conversation earlier. And after about a decade on the Hill, looking at them from that side, I've spent the last 20 years both participating in and looking at what happens when a deeply corrupt foreign assistance community starts giving assistance to this part of the world. And we focus more along the discussion of this morning about the intersection of power and money and that how it influences terrible programs on the ground. But it's this personal and institutional and individual part that's so intriguing to me now. In so many interviews we've done, pretty much everyone agrees after about 20 years of assistance, particularly in the authoritarian states, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, it's been a disaster. And so many people on the ground, even working in counter-narcotics trafficking programs or democracy building, have complained to me, the bind they're in, that on the one hand, they honestly feel we have been feeding, training, equipping, and funding drug traffickers to traffic better. And yet, on the other hand, the models that they've had for their whole life by working in this foreign assistance community lead them to still believe what they're doing is so right, that the measurements are right and the decisions are right, and the way our assistance is structured is right, and it just must be the fault of the recipients that it's not working. So I'm just wondering, how do you cut through that when you're combining all the different influences that you've discussed today? Is there a way to cut into it when it's so both institutional and personal?
We don't know who that question was for.
Who was that for? Eldar? Or
I mean, I'll say one thing. I'm not sure it connects, but it's a free association. I spend a lot of time around people who do financial education in DC. And that's built on the idea, that's what reminded me of, that we're trying so hard and they just don't get it. So we'll educate them. They'll stop taking payday loans. They'll start paying their phone bills on time. And if you look at it from a certain perspective, and I'm not blaming these people, I think their intentions are good, it's just comes very close to blaming the victim. And I think people just don't have a good sense of the structure they've imposed and how unmanageable that is to the people who have to navigate it. So, we trained the soldiers who went to Abu Ghraib. They got ethics courses. Good luck. We teach you ethics, we send you to Abu Ghraib, you'll become an animal. 9 out of 10 guaranteed. The poor in America, the near poor, approaching 150 million, are living in a financial Abu Ghraib. To teach them the finances is kind of absurd. I got it. I need to save. Thank you very much. Now, what am I going to save? How am I going to save it? Who's going to save it for me? And the USDA gives people lectures about the food pyramid in places where they cannot find a piece of fresh vegetable or fruit if they wanted to. And so I think in a lot of these cases, these are well-intentioned people who miss the link between the structure they've imposed and what's required of the participants for whom it's built, who just cannot manage it.
we will take one last question.
I'm Ken Pittman I studied linguistics at that place down the street a long time ago. And so I guess everybody looks at it through the lens of their own experience, and I just, some of the things, and maybe this goes to Anne because you were sort of closest on this particular topic before, I just keep seeing everything from a linguistic point of view, just what are the meanings of the words when we talk about things, and I wanted to almost ask the other panel, but I was waiting for the linguists to show up, and they weren't. But when you say trust in an institution, in my mind, from an AI background, I've programmed up like, what do words mean, and try to make programs do this. And you can't actually just trust something. You have to know what it is you're trusting. My mom had a stroke last year, and after she recovered, we were talking about the issue of what she was trusting me to do. Because I said, it's great that you trust me, but what did you want this person to look at your finances or not? And I didn't know, so there wasn't any use in the trust. When we talk about the loss of trust in an entity. The war that's going on right now is kind of a war over the dictionary. You see it in the pro-life movement, for example. People want to like own that word life because there's something about the drift in this seems to be somehow around the words, and I wonder if it even goes to the question of is memory stored in words, and do we store the word, and then when we call it back up, we can drift by the amount that the word could mean or something, and is that the leverage that a lobbyist has that says, you promised these words, and we can get those words to mean this other thing? And so, does it drift that way? Nobody's really raised this issue, and I was just curious if you have a comment on how just the use of language and, like when we say the job creators, like, what does that mean exactly? And does it mean people who actually create jobs, or does it mean the people who call themselves job creators?
Or does it mean the filthy rich, right? So both of those have been used
right, but
to
if
describe
I'm
the same set of
trusting
people.
them, am I trusting those people or the people described by the description? And is that the same? It's just messy.
Yeah, so I don't know much about drift and within the memory. I just say there is drift over time, and to me, one of the more recent examples that I've commented on is Penn State, and you can certainly see the drift in the language used to describe from, pretty brutal rape to the boy felt uncomfortable. And if you've read the grand jury, you can see even as it's going through that, you can see some of that. So I think that there is drift in over time, in general, by all people, because everybody feels uncomfortable by those words, and so.
And I would just add that the drift seems, from my perspective, to move more often in the system exonerating direction than the system implicating one.
All right. I'd like to thank the panel again for their talks and to you for your great questions, and we'll take a break.
So it struck me that study, I forgot it was Jamie.